Was Grant a butcher? Oh, okay. I know. Grant got the nickname because he did, and that is true, historically accurate, he did throw his men at the enemy, but it was justified. So let's dive into the world of butchers and some other U.S. presidents and also a general. Now, Ulysses S. Grant. Who was he? Now, Ulysses S. Grant was born in a relatively well-doing family, but he still struggled. He attended West Point right on the year that his future best bud, William Tecumseh Sherman, would graduate. And then, after that, he got a military career during the Mexican-American War, and then during the American Civil War, he was in charge of the Western Theater. And then, he was promoted to commanding general and sent to the East to be in charge of Mr. Lincoln's army, or the Army of the Potomac. Now, as he did all of this, his opponent was Lee. And Grant knew that Lee could not replace his casualties, and also had fewer men. And the Army of the Potomac, it had enough men, and could also sustain its armies no matter how many casualties. So in most armies, they would attack, and if the enemy was able to repel it, then they would draw back, get reinforcements, and then come. But instead of that, Grant just did this. Bang, bang, bang. It's basically the same thing that Sherman was doing back in the West, in the Western Theater. And as he did this, he got closer and closer and closer and closer to Richmond. Same thing happened here in Atlanta, for Atlanta. But as he did this, he also did some very terrible things. For example, the Battle of Cold Harbor. The Battle of Cold Harbor, and of course the Battle of the Wilderness, had terrible Union casualties in these miscalculated attacks. And after the Battle of the Wilderness, and Grant received the news of how many people had died, Grant reportedly wept and probably got drunk on whiskey because that's what he likes to do. Now, yes, Grant was an alcoholic. During the siege of Vicksburg, he got drunk. Yes. And he got really drunk when Vicksburg fell, because he thought it was time to get drunk because it was also the 4th of July. So, with all of that in mind, with all these throwing his men at the enemy and getting drunk all day long and loving whiskey, all of that seems very bad. But let's see the positives. Now, of course, all these deaths were not good, especially for the people who actually died. But one thing you have to understand is simply that with this, he could just slam into Lee. And although he has massive casualties, he can replace the casualties. Lee cannot replace his casualties. So as they get closer and closer to Richmond, the Army of Northern Virginia also gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And once they get to Appomattox Courthouse, it becomes so weak that General Lee surrenders. Now, it's time to give the answer. Grant was a butcher and also a savior. Grant, although he did many terrible things and was responsible for the deaths of many, he still was justified for all this. This was for the war effort. It's war, baby, okay? Just remember that. When it's war, you have to do anything at any measure in order to win that war. And that was what Grant was doing. And because of that, and even though he did all of that pretty well, you can't forget that, yes, a lot of people died because of Grant himself. And because Grant also was responsible for deaths, you can't make him a complete savior. So Grant was, yes, a butcher, but he also did it for a justified cause. That is by far the most complicated answer I have ever given besides the word no and yes. So, there you have it. Grant was a butcher and also a savior. And that's that. I'm sorry, Ku Klux Klan members. That's just the way the world works.